I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days I thought would never end. I've seen lonely times when I could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Fire and Rain Conversation series, a series designed to inform and empower bushfire-prone communities to live safely with fire. We like to start by acknowledging the Ma people of the land we're speaking from today and their deep and continuous connection with the land. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging.
Thinking back on episodes 1 and 2, we're stepping into the challenge today to discover how we can best manage country together. We have Kevin Tolhurst, Associate Professor of Fire Ecology and Management at University of Melbourne and an expert on fire behaviour and fire suppression strategies. And Tim Gazzard, Team Leader, Risk and Evaluation in the Barwon Southwest or Otways region. Kevin and Tim, thank you. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yay. It's a chilly morning where we are, freezing cold out in Forest. We're looking forward to having our chat with you today. We've been told, Kevin and Tim, that we are one of Australia's highest bushfire risk communities. Justin Leonard, back in episode 1, tells us the first thing we need to do is understand our risk. So we're wondering if you can help us. What are the risks over the next 10-year period to this Forest and Otway region, and how do we understand these? We might start with you, Kevin.
Okay, well, I guess the one of the reasons why the Otways is such a high risk area is because it's so close to the coast. And so the winds can be quite strong there because it's coming off the ocean, and you're very susceptible to wind changes. So fundamentally, I guess from just a climate point of view, you're in quite an exposed area. Now, added to that, I guess, is the rugged terrain that surrounds the Otway region. And the rugged terrain adds extra energy to fire. So in addition to the effects of fuel that a lot of people talk about, the terrain can add energy, the climate can add energy, the weather can add energy, and the atmospheric instability can add energy to the fire. And all of those factors play out in the Otway ranges. And that's why, in combination, you're actually living in a very fire-prone part of the world.
Thanks, Kevin. Tim, you're down in this region specifically. What can you add to that?
Yeah, look, everything Kevin said makes sense to me. At that really local scale for something like Forest, you've got, if you think about the terrain there, you've got not massive hills running up into Forest so much, but you've got little rises, and those little rises up around Boundary Road there, the Yolga Trailhead, and also to the west, directly to the west of Forest, you've got, again, little rises, and that all adds energy to any fires that might, I guess, head towards Forest, and that they contribute to sort of the short distance spotting that might be Forest experiences from some of those fires starting nearby. And I guess we do a lot of analysis across the whole landscape to try and understand that bushfire risk and where we put our efforts. And I guess what our analysis shows is that fires that do get started to the north and northwest, up to about 10 k's away, they can cause quite significant loss within the forest community. It's quite I guess compared to somewhere like an Anglesey or even a Lorne township, where they've got a reasonably sort of hard interface, if you think they've got maybe a little bit more development within the town itself. Forest is a little bit more open or porous in that sense, and a fire can actually move into the forest community reasonably fluidly in that way, and that also adds to the risk.
Thank you. I'm curious about the scale, and I guess not all fires are the same, and it's about understanding our risk to help reduce anxiety and enable, a measured and considered response. So what kind of indicators are there, things that we can look for, as summer approaches, or how do we know what we're in for, in a sense?
So I guess if I can address that partly, I think somewhere like Forest can be exposed to two distinct types of fires in a way, and you need to be prepared for both. And what Tim has explained has covered that to some extent. So one is a fire that can impact on the town in a relatively short period of time, within 1 or 2 hours of the fire starting. And a fire starting particularly to the north or the west of forest is a fire that would burn under those sort of situations. So for that to happen, the grasslands in the cleared areas would need to be fairly dry already. So if they're green, they're not going to burn basically. But if they're partially cured or fully cured, then a fast-moving fire could easily impact on the town quite quickly. And even though it may not necessarily be such a big fire, it would still potentially be deadly and devastating to somewhere like forest, particularly because you're surrounded by stringy bark forest, which creates a lot of embers, and so would propagate by creating not just one fire, but potentially hundreds of fires around forest areas. So it'd be very difficult to even, once the fire's established, to actually get away from the township because fires would be starting all around. The second scenario really is the sort of the large fire event, like we would see under Black Saturday conditions or Ash Wednesday conditions, where the landscape has dried out from a decade of drought. And so forest is situated in the more western part of the Otways, where there's a lot of wet forest. And in most years, that wet forest wouldn't dry out enough to carry a fire. But in drought conditions, it does carry a fire, and it not only carries a fire, but those fires are incredibly intense. And so they create massive convection columns, and that convection column helps produce local weather conditions, particularly strong winds, and that dramatically increases the impact of a fire. And so those sort of fires that could come more from the west or the southwest or the south of forest would take several hours to develop, and would have to be probably a couple of thousand hectares in size before they really had an impact on the town. So that's a big fire event. And in that case, you would have to have serious thoughts about actually evacuating the area unless you were very confident that you could defend your property under almost any conditions. So the fire coming from the north, you should really have your house and your property prepared in a way that you could defend it. And if you can't defend your property, maybe you ought to be talking to your neighbour or looking at some community location that you would go to I guess, ride out the passage of the worst part of the fire. But under the bigger, so that's under perhaps a more normal sort of summer condition. But in drought conditions where you have a big fire starting to the west or the south of forest, you would really want to be considering an evacuation type strategy. But you get a little more warning for that, but you need to act as soon as you actually get the early indicators, not wait until the fire is on top of you, because often if you're waiting for the fire to get to you, it's too late.
Kevin, you developed a software program or a bushfire behaviour program, and it's called Phoenix Rapid Fire Model. And it helps to predict the risks and helps communities, emergency services make decisions. Can you talk us through how that might have played out with last summer's fires, and how we would use that software to give us a visual representation of those two examples you spoke about, what that might look like for our community?
Yeah, so I guess some of the important characteristics of Phoenix Rapid Fire is that it's a dynamic representation of fire behaviour, and fire behaviour is very dynamic. There are a lot of feedbacks, positive and negative feedbacks in the growth and development and behaviour of the fires. So that's too complex to do in a simple spreadsheet or a simple calculation process. So that's why you use a simulator. So looking at some of the images that are produced from the simulations from a fire give you a much better idea about the distance of spotting, the nature of spot fire starting, and even if you overlay the simulation on something like Google Earth, you can put yourself down at ground level in somewhere like forest and get a perception of what the smoke plume might look like some distance off. And it's really interesting when you start playing with that, because from the ground, you can actually see the fire and think it's a long way off. in reality, if you actually take an aeroplane sort of view of the fire, you actually see it's actually quite close and it can be quite threatening already. So your perception from the ground is very different from an aerial view. And so using something like Phoenix Rapid Fire to do that simulation and then view it on a three-dimensional sort of environment like Google Earth, it better enables you to interpret what you're actually seeing on the ground. And it can be quite deceptive often, what you're seeing on the ground compared with what's actually happening. You're not seeing all the spot fires and you're not seeing really the scale of the fire from the ground. And so work that people like Tim have done in looking at different fire scenarios across the Otways has been really instructive when you start to look at it in terms of what the nature of the fires might be, and therefore what an appropriate response might be, and perhaps even from a planning point of view, what sort of mitigation strategies are likely to be effective. And the mitigation strategies might include things like communication. It might be about community plans in terms of what their action might be, and it might be about prescribed burning in the surrounding landscape. So there's a whole host of other potential strategies you could take, but all those options need to be considered, and the best combination of those needs to be developed really by the local community.
Can I just add to that, Kevin? I think one of the real advantages of having something like Phoenix Rapid Fire from a management point of view is that you can test all those what if scenarios that may never have happened yet, but so I guess we don't see many of those really large fires like an Ash Wednesday or a Black Saturday event very often, which is a good thing. But it does make it harder from a management point of view than to sort of understand what a fire might look like under those conditions starting somewhere else in the landscape. So Phoenix has been really helpful, still is really helpful for us to do those sort of scenario testing, if you like, and say, well, what if a fire like an Ash Wednesday started over at Jellybrand? What would that actually look like in the landscape? And I guess that to break it down into what are the components there, the spotting and the convection and the intensity of the fire, the flame height, so that you actually start to understand the fire behaviour at different points in the landscapes. Actually, it's a pretty insightful thing for management to have in our back pocket, if you like. So.
Tim, I'm curious about how that translates and comes back to the community. So if you're busy working on that modelling in the middle of summer, how does that information feed back to us in the community? Basically.
Yeah, so I guess in some ways we probably don't feed back as much as we could, but I guess I'm thinking about things like as the season goes on, and these are probably things we could think about to the future now that we've got this technology there. I mean, you could run the simulator many times around a community like Forest, and you could actually understand how as the season dries out, if you like, you get more into the peak of summer. How does your risk change in terms of some of those ignitions that start further away? Actually, as things get drier, potentially could start to reach somewhere like Forest. Whereas early on in the season, when there's still a little bit of moisture around and the grass is still relatively green, then it's much harder. There's much more energy required for the fire to actually burn through those areas, if you like. So the fires are generally going to be smaller, and then as the season gets drier and fuels become more available, then you're likely to see ignitions further away potentially, or have the potential to impact on somewhere like Forest. So I think there's probably some little basic risk products that we could be starting to think about writing to somewhere like Forest to understand that risk, maybe not on a day-by-day basis, but more that every couple of weeks as the season changes.
So the series is designed to inform and empower our community, and one of the earlier episodes we talked with Jack Pascoe and John Clark, and they talked about how we can use fire as a tool to help prevent some of these bigger bushfires. Is that something that you guys talk about within, the fuel management, the land management space, and is that an area that we need to start talking about within our community as accepting a bit more fire within our area?
I think we need to view fire as a natural part of the environment in the same way as we consider wind and rain as part of the environment. And if we consider rain, if it all occurred, the annual rainfall all occurred within a 4 or 5 day period, we'd have massive flooding and we'd have massive erosion events, and it would cause an enormous amount of damage. Well, fire in a way is no different. Fire, when it occurs in a short period of time in a major bushfire event, is quite catastrophic. But in reality, fire would naturally occur in smaller events and more regularly across the year if we allowed it to. But with our suppression effects and our ability to control fires, we basically let the amount of energy in the environment build up to a point where when it does get released, it's beyond human control to be able to stop the fire anymore. We get these catastrophic wildfires. So prescribed burning is important to be able to gradually release that energy from the landscape over time and basically replace the natural wildfires that would have occurred in the past. And I guess from the earlier episode, you would have heard that I guess the traditional use of fire in the landscape was very objective focused. There were always a strong reason why fire was put into the landscape. And it just so happened as a result of that, that maintained enough fire in the landscape to keep the landscape sustainable from a fire point of view. And we've moved away from that. So we actually need to learn from some of the traditional owners' practices of using fire to be a bit smarter and a bit more comprehensive about the use of fire, and not just focus on fuel management. Fuel management is such a human-centered sort of idea. We ought to be using fire to maintain the sustainability of the landscape. And that's where communities like Forest and other communities within the Otways really need to take some interest and engage with the land management agencies in developing the objectives and taking some ownership and shared responsibility for the inclusion and extension of fire in the landscape. One of the things that we've found over the last 20, 30 years really is it's become much harder to do prescribed burning in the landscape because there's so much fear and concern about the damage that prescribed burning might be doing. There's almost a mistrust, I guess, that the communities put all these constraints on doing prescribed burning, that the window of opportunity to prescribe burning has been narrowed down to almost nothing. There's a lot of discussion that climate change is doing that. Well, I don't totally agree with that. I think climate change, if anything, is actually extending that window, but it's the socio-political constraints that we're putting on that. And as community members, we need to actually be encouraging that, but it has to be done in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And that the spin-off for that will also be a reduction in the level of risk. So move away from just a fuel focus into basically a sustainable land focus. And so there's a lot we can learn from the traditional owners there, where they were looking at multiple objectives for managing fire in the landscape. And we need to follow down that path and enable the technical specialists in Parks Victoria and Department of Environment, Land, Water Planning to basically apply fire or have fire in the landscape. But we need to accept there's going to be some smoke. There's going to be an element of risk with that, but the overall cost and the risk associated with keeping fire in the landscape will be significantly less than having periodic catastrophic wildfires.
Maybe just jumping in on the objective bit there as a start, I've probably got a little bit to say on this one locally. Like we've spent a lot of energy in the Otways over probably a 10-year period, but particularly in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, to develop this sort of long-term strategy. And that really started with this idea of objectives. And we need to sort of, we took it and we needed to take it a multi-objective sort of focus. And what I mean by that is that we need to understand why we might put fire in to meet a range of different needs. And one of those needs is reducing bushfire risk to community. Another one of those needs might be if you're in the growing trees from a plantation point of view is how does bushfire impact on plantations? Another sort of objective might be around water catchments and how does fire maybe impact on our water quality or water quantity in different ways. Another one might be from the tourism industry, which is important obviously for forest. How does that then start to impact, whether it's bushfire or plant fire, impact on the tourism operators, if you like, that need to have a healthy environment or a good looking environment maybe sometimes, or at least an available area to actually go and take people out in, or from a mountain bike point of view, actually have somewhere to ride. And I guess the other sort of really important objective for us is making sure we maintain healthy environments. So what we invested a lot of energy into having those conversations and working out, I guess what I think about is what's an appropriate amount of fire for the Otway ranges, and we've got a reasonably settled strategy that tries to balance out all those objectives or things that I just talked about that are important to different groups. So I think out of that, we've got this, I guess what we think about as a long-term strategy. It tells us where in the landscape we'd like to apply fire, and or maybe sometimes where we might like to exclude fire for a range of reasons, and often it's about ecological outcomes. Some plant communities don't need a lot of fire to necessarily survive, maybe just need really long periods between fire. But it's also about the strategy also sort of explains or outlines, I suppose, how much fire we'd like to put in different parts of the landscape. And if I just hone in on the forest community a little bit here, is to give an example of what that looks like for forest. Around the sort of out to about 3 kilometres around forest, we've got this strategy that says we're going to come back every sort of 5 to 8 years to each of the burn units, I guess we call them, where you've got a logical sort of track, a drivable track around these areas, which equates to sort of maybe a burn every year, or maybe sometimes 2 burns around the forest community. And then if we just go out a little bit further, so you start at that sort of 3K sort of radius, particularly to the north and the west, and we move out a little bit further, we've got going out to maybe a 5K radius, we've got these additional sort of ring of burn units, if you like, that we'd like to come back to every maybe 10 to 13 years in that sort of period, if you like, or that sort of frequency. So that over a 40-year period, that would be four times potentially. And if you go out even further again, out to this sort of 10 to 20K mark, then we've got some burns planned, not just for forest now, I guess, starting to think about disrupting fire spread through the landscape, but if you go to the west of Jellybrand, some of those burns we're doing down there actually potentially benefit the forest community as well. Or the burns we're doing out around Barongarook or Kawarren, or the Tomahawk Creek area a bit further there to the west. Those burns also are contributing to potentially some risk reduction to the forest community. So,
if a community, agencies, scientists were sharing the responsibilities for fires, and this was working really well, and we've been doing it for 20 years, what, if we could reimagine it, what would that actually look like in your opinion? If we were doing this well, we'd reframe the conversation and everyone was communicating and acting and taking responsibility and accountability for managing land. What would that look like? Can you imagine it and describe it for us?
Yeah, I think that ideal world is where we at least understand where all of the objectives that we've set out. So whether it's things like water catchment values, whether it's about fauna and flora values, whether it's about protection of human life and property, we understand, I guess, as a whole, so both the land management agencies, the fire response agencies and the local communities understand where those objectives come from. We mightn't all agree with those objectives, but we understand that as a community, we have to have some compromises. So the trade-offs process has been gone through, and that might take 2 or 3 years at least of discussions to do that. Lots of barbecues, lots of walking out in the bush, all those sort of things that we can't do very easily at the moment. But that is part of the shared responsibility. We need to take some ownership of what it is that needs to be done and have our opportunity to say our piece, to say what's important to us and what it is we're prepared to compromise on, in a sense, for the greater good. So the good of the environment, or the good of our local community, or the good of the state, if you like. So there's a cost involved in doing any of this work. And so we have to be realistic about what level of resources and so on we have. But it may be, for example, when we understand that we may be able to make a contribution in a way as an individual in the community that reduces the costs significantly. So it might be just a neighbourhood decides that we're going to clean up along the forest boundary, for example, and that's then something that doesn't have to be done by a land management agency. And so that helps facilitate a process of protection of communities. So it's very difficult often for fire and land management agencies to engage with the public, but the public also will often put their hands up and say, well, I pay my taxes, it's someone else's responsibility. It really doesn't work like that. We all have a responsibility here, and it's not good enough just to be a critic. We also have to be a player. And I think you only get should only have a choice to have an opinion or a say if you're actually got some skin in the game, so you're actually contributing. So I think we need to go away from the paternalistic sort of the government needs to look after this. It's a government responsibility to saying that we're all in this together. So that means the government agencies have to give some responsibility to individuals, but at the same time, we will see a shared responsibility of the workload and the responsibility. So the risk is shared as well. It's not all the government should protect me. I'm taking my actions, and so I ought to be able to see some commensurate action being taken at a government level, if you like, to support what I'm doing. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. So that's my perfect world, and it's not something easily achieved, but it's about relationship. And again, if we go back to the traditional owner approach, where we have elders and we have totems and so on in the system, we appreciate some people have more knowledge than others, and some people have to carry the I guess a lot of that knowledge, but it's shared. It's not in one person's head. It's not in one organisational's basket. So that's really the shared responsibility is a big issue.
Thanks, Kevin. That's beautifully put, and I hope that we head towards that scenario, because that's what for me, you know, and our journeying in this process, that seems to be a really good direction for us to go.
Give us a sense of what gives you hope. So often these conversations are quite serious and intense, but we always ask our guests to have a little think about this beforehand and give us some examples of what gives you hope. So perhaps to you first, Tim, can you give us tell us what gives you hope?
I think for me that one of the really great things I've enjoyed about working in Otways for the last 10 years is just those relationships we've got between the agencies that all have a joint responsibility for some sort of fire outcome, whether that's in the planning space or whether that's in the recovery or the actual suppression, but also those relationships with the community. And I think that's to me, I reckon, gives me hope that by having those sort of conversations or having I guess the right framework or the relationships is maybe the right word to continue sometimes having hard conversations. Maybe sometimes it is about some compromise or trade-off there, but that's what really drives change and potentially leads to safer communities and better environmental outcomes too. I think it's that sort of joint outcome that we're really seeking. And
yeah, that's what we're fully intending having our conversation series, is to keep these things rolling. Kevin, what gives you hope?
Well, I think it's very similar to Tim in a sense. I think I'm a fire ecologist rather than a fire behaviourist, I guess, fundamentally. But so I have quite a strong connection to the land and fire in its own right. And the thing that gives me hope is that the conversations that are going on, like your series here, where people have a yearning to learn more about the importance of fire in the landscape, and not just seeing fire as a damaging process, but also as an enabling and a sustaining process. I think that shift in thinking is really important, and the willingness of community groups to start getting engaged. I reckon we're in very early days there, but I think the process at least is starting to roll on. And the big change for me that gives me some hope is I guess the rise of interest in traditional owners and their knowledge. And to me, we can't just go back to what the traditional owners used to do, because we're in a very different landscape, but there's so much we can learn from that. And I think that door has opened, and there's a lot of goodwill from traditional owners to share their knowledge and be involved. So the combination of the communities wanting to have a conversation, the traditional owners being involved in that conversation, and the government agencies being involved in that conversation, I think is a really positive thing. So it's just a matter of maintaining that momentum and making sure that it's directed in a way that will have long-lasting benefits. I think that's what gives me hope, is that I think we're heading in the right direction. As slowly as the progress might be, for me, I'm maybe impatient, but I think we're heading in the right direction, and there's certainly some new impetus being given to the discussions and the progress in using fire and having fire in the landscape as a natural part of the environment.
Thanks, Kevin. And thanks to both of you for taking the time with us today and sharing your wisdom. You both have given me hope that we can do it. Thank you both for joining us and giving us your time and wisdom today. Thank you.
If you'd like to know more about this topic, and a list of the resources mentioned by Kevin and Tim will be on our website at fireandrainconversations.org. If you have any questions, comments or feedback from today's episode, or for the conversation series more generally, please get in touch via the website. Next episode, we're changing tack completely, and we're talking about art and its role in fire and emergency management. So we look forward to talking with you then. Thank you.
But I always thought that I'd see you again.